Welcome back and thanks for staying with us. Now, motorists are urged to fill up their tanks before the latest fuel price increase takes effect at midnight. South Africans will be hard hit financially as the petrol price hits an all-time high of around 16 rands a litre. The price of petrol and diesel will go up by around 26 cents a litre, paraffin by 22 cents and LP gas by 37 cents a kilogram. The Department of Energy has attributed the increase to the weakening of the rand against the dollar for the period under review. This will be the fifth fuel increase this year, adding even further strain on consumers amid increases from municipal rates to food prices. Now, to unpack the issue, we invited our economics editor, Thandeka Gqubule, to help us understand. Thandeka, welcome to the agenda. Why another petrol price hike?
Well, first of all, the Central Energy Fund, the CEF, sets the petrol price on every Wednesday of every month, right? So what has been happening both in the currency and in the international prices of oil and has pushed up the amount that is to be paid by the consumer back home. But there are five main reasons, Des, why the petrol price is increasing. The first reason is the increase in fuel and road accident levies that was announced in February by the Minister of Finance. So when those increase, you will see a little bump and an increase in the price that the consumer has to pay. Mm-hmm. Then there are sort of logistical problems like the decommissioning of the Durban to Johannesburg pipeline, which is called the DJP by Transnet. That happened in March, but it probably still has a knock-on effect on the price right now. And then the third reason is the increase in transportation costs. Remember that before your petrol gets into your petrol tank, it has traveled a long international sea voyage before it actually gets there. And the land transport costs from the port and to inland, that's why inland is increasing. The cost of petrol inland is increasing far more than the cost of petrol at the coast. Now, that's driven by the increase in the transportation costs from the port to inland cities.
Thandeka, notwithstanding those realities, government is supposed to be the administrator and they should supposed to plan ahead and take the population into consideration when these events occur. Are we saying that government is not able to plan this properly?
No, I mean, we South Africans like to blame government for everything. In fact, I'm of the view that regulation by government of the price of petrol is actually a positive thing, because you must remember that petrol is, or the price of oil, is that tide that raises all the ships. And so government, by keeping it steady, and in its energy white paper and energy policy documents saying that its aim is twofold: to keep the price as low as possible and to make basic fuel and petrol available to as a broad a mass of citizens as possible. Now, I think that's extremely progressive. And I think regulation itself protects the South African economy from shocks in the international and fluctuations in the international prices. Now, South Africa buys its petrol on spot markets abroad, and there the price is determined on a daily basis. Now, that can create a lot of fluctuations that have a negative effect on the South African economy. So the fact that government actually regulates the petrol price is a progressive thing, because it steadies the price anticipations of ordinary consumers, citizens, and particularly businesses. Because remember that the price of petrol affects businesses and ultimately has a cascading, a domino effect, even onto the price of food. So this is a protection mechanism that insulates the South African economy from international factors over which the South African government has very little control.
Well-known financial editor Sikonathi Mantshantsha says that it might as well be the markets at play that are impacting on the prices of fuel, but it's also bad decisions in terms of government, including corruption. Do you have that sense in this particular
Well,
instance?
I feel that we could have managed the CEF, the Central Energy Fund, better, and I think we could have managed our reserves better. But I do not think that the major factor at the moment is the fact that there's been a decline in the value of currencies throughout emerging markets. Yeah. There's a huge contraction taking place, and we've begun to worry about second quarter GDP at the moment. And Absolutely. If we have another deep contraction, having had a 2.2 contraction in the first quarter, may I say that I'm really beginning to fear technically going into recession. Now, let me say this. I do not agree that with Manjanja to the extent that I think that it's the international happenings that are driving the current rise in oil prices as well as the dip in our currency. Now, we're buying internationally expensive petrol, more expensive petrol since the beginning of this year. We are buying it on a weaker rand. We're basically price takers, and there's very little we can do about that. And I think that regulation of the price domestically is a positive thing. May I just explain the voyage very briefly and very simply so that the consumer and our listeners and viewers out there can understand that by the time it goes into the tank, we've already paid about 7 times. First of all is the price that's determined internationally on the spot markets, the basic fuel price, the BFP, and then we don't determine that. We simply take the price, and we then have freight costs. Basically the freight costs are the cost of shipping that oil. And we've got billions of barrels coming into South Africa.
I hear you.
Then when it gets to the port, we have to pay those custom duties to bring it onto the land. And then on a 25-day basis, we have to pay storage costs. And then once we've paid the storage costs, which is the beginning of the domestically controlled price regime, then we have to transport it inland, and then from inland it goes to a depot inland, and from the depot it goes to the distribution points. At each of these points, the South African taxpayer and consumer is paying.
The value chain that you explain hasn't changed, though. It remains constant, doesn't it?
Yes.
How do we explain to our viewer how your explanation separates South Africa from other African countries who pay much less for fuel than we do?
Okay. For example, in Lesotho and Swaziland and Botswana, where we don't have the same regulatory regime, the prices will then vary because they don't pay the road accident fund, they don't pay the various tariffs and taxes that we pay within the South African jurisdiction, and the decommissioning of the Durban to Johannesburg pipeline would not have affected them as significantly as it did us. And then the rand exchange rate is unique to us.
Different
for example, the pula is at a higher level than the rand. So look, I mean, there are prices and costs that we can control, and there are prices, mainly the international happenings, and prices that we cannot control.
We know that with every petrol price hike comes other costs, such as the impacts of VAT going to 15%, the impacts of food prices going up. From an economics point of view, what can a consumer do to survive this vicious cycle?
Well, you know, Desiree, as the economics editor, we have had a challenging time imagining what the consumer is going through. So we have prepared a package and a whole slew of reporting packages, a broadcast plan to get the consumer to tell us how they actually mitigate the costs, how they strategically navigate their way around the rising costs throughout the economy. For example, we are asking people, what percentage of your domestic income goes to transportations? Are you basically working to get yourself back to work each day? What amount of that goes into the cost of transporting your children to school? And I listened on one of our radio stations this morning to a guy saying that these costs and the costs of fuel is changing his dating life indeed. He's rather Skyping his partner, and they're having dinner in different venues. But anyway, many South Africans are innovating around these prices, and we are looking forward to giving as precise and as well-informed reporting and advice as we possibly can. So from our conversation, can I sum up that all that is required for this to change around is economic growth? Yes, and I am saying further that I've begun to worry about the perils and the challenges and the constraints to growth, particularly in this quarter, due to the significant contraction experienced by emerging markets because of global geopolitics and the trade wars, etc. So probably no relief in sight. No relief in sight, but we need to tighten our belts and be more strategic, and policy-wise we need to rethink a few things, and operationally we need to get our house in order with the pipeline, and perhaps even re-examine our pricing model and structure. Thandeka Gqubule is our economics editor, just helping us to make sense of the imminent fuel price hike this around 12 p.m. this evening. We hope that suffices. I don't know if it can, but let's take a break for now. We'll be back in a moment.